Sarah Johnson was living a happy newlywed life with her husband Michael in a small house in a quiet residential area of Boston. She worked as an English teacher at a local high school, while Michael was building his career as a promising young lawyer at a law firm. They had been college sweethearts and married right after graduation. "Sarah, what's for dinner tonight?" Michael asked one Friday evening when he came home from work. "I thought we'd have Italian today." "I wanted to try a new recipe," Sarah replied. She loved cooking and looked forward to trying new dishes every weekend. As they enjoyed their dinner, they talked about their plans for the future. Having children had been a shared dream since the beginning of their marriage. "Maybe it's time we start thinking about having a baby," Michael brought up. Sarah's eyes lit up. "Really? I've been thinking the same thing." That night, they decided to try for a baby. And a few months later, Sarah found out she was pregnant. During the pregnancy, Michael took great care of Sarah and accompanied her to all prenatal checkups. They prepared the baby's room and held a baby shower. Friends and family gathered to offer their blessings. "You two are going to be wonderful parents," Sarah's mother said. On the day of the birth, Michael held Sarah's hand at the hospital, encouraging her throughout. After a long labor, their son Ethan was born on May 15, 2013. "Look, Sarah. It's our son," Michael said, tears in his eyes. Sarah was exhausted but filled with happiness. "I've never seen such a perfect baby," she smiled. After Ethan's birth, Sarah and Michael's lives changed completely. Nights of feeding, diaper changes, and lack of sleep. But they truly enjoyed their new life. "He really looks like you," Sarah said to Michael one day while cuddling Ethan. Michael smiled proudly. "But he has your eyes." Day by day, Ethan grew. His first smile, his first words, his first steps. Every moment became a priceless treasure for Sarah and Michael. One day, when Ethan was 3 months old, Sarah returned home from work. Usually, Michael would greet her with their son in his arms. But the house was silent. "Michael. Ethan." Sarah called out, but there was no answer. Feeling anxious, she searched the whole house, but there was no sign of them. On the table, there was a note from Michael. "Had to leave for an urgent work matter. Will be back soon." Sarah felt a little relieved, but something felt off. It was rare for Michael to take their son to work. Hours passed, and night fell, but they still hadn't returned. Sarah grew worried and called Michael's cell phone several times, but it seemed to be turned off. The next morning, when Sarah realized they still hadn't returned, she panicked. She immediately called the police. "Mrs. Johnson, how long has it been since your husband and son went missing?" the officer asked. "Since yesterday afternoon, about 18 hours, Sarah answered with a shaky voice. The police began their search, but there were few leads. Michael's car was nowhere to be found. When they inquired at his workplace, they were told there had been no urgent work matter. Days passed, turning into weeks, then months. Sarah desperately continued to search for them. She put up posters all over town, spread information on social media, and even appeared on TV shows about missing persons. "Has anyone seen my husband and son?" Sarah pleaded to the camera. "Please, if you have any information, contact the police." But no solid leads came in. The police continued their investigation, but there was no progress. "Mrs. Johnson, to be honest, we think this might be a case of planned disappearance," the detective quietly informed her. Sarah couldn't believe it. "That's impossible. Michael loved us. And Ethan." Family and friends continued to support Sarah, but they couldn't completely heal the pain in her heart. "Sarah, you should rest a bit more," her mother gently said. But Sarah didn't give up. "My son is out there somewhere. I'll keep searching until I find him." Time passed, and with each of Ethan's birthdays, Sarah would buy a small cake and light candles. "Happy birthday, Ethan," she would whisper. "Mommy loves you. We'll meet again someday." Time flowed on, and 10 years passed since that day. Sarah still lives in the same house and continues her work as a teacher. Her life was moving forward quietly but surely. Still, it had become her habit to look at Ethan's photo every night before bed. One Saturday afternoon, Sarah was tending to her garden. As the autumn sunlight gently fell on her shoulders, she was absorbed in pruning roses. Suddenly, she saw a figure move by the gate. Sarah looked up and gasped at the sight of the boy standing there. The boy was about 13 years old, with brown hair and blue eyes. His features overlapped with the baby face forever etched in Sarah's heart. "Ethan!" Sarah called out in a trembling voice. The boy nodded slightly, looking anxious. "Mom." Sarah stood up and approached the boy. Her heart was beating wildly. "Is it really you?" Ethan nodded again, this time with tears in his eyes. "Mom, help me." Sarah couldn't hold back anymore and ran to embrace Ethan. 10 years' worth of emotions poured out at once, and they both cried wordlessly. After a while, Sarah came to her senses and invited Ethan into the house. A moment of silence passed between them as they sat in the living room. "How did you?" Sarah quietly asked. Ethan took a deep breath and began to speak. "Dad, no, Michael." He continued, choosing his words carefully. "We kept moving around, but recently, we came back to Boston." "Michael, is he all right?" Sarah asked with a complex expression. Ethan's face clouded over. "Yes, but Mom, I don't want to go back there anymore." Sarah noticed the change in her son's expression and felt anxiety well up. "Why? What happened?" Ethan hesitated, then slowly rolled up the sleeve of his right arm. There were multiple scars. Sarah gasped. "These are..." "There's a lot I need to tell you, Mom," Ethan said with a serious expression. "But I think we should call the police first." Sarah came to her senses and immediately called the police. 30 minutes later, 2 officers visited the house. Mrs. Johnson, about the missing person case from 10 years ago. The officer began, and Sarah nodded. Yes, this is my son Ethan. The officers talked with Ethan and confirmed the situation. Afterward, it was decided that Ethan would be placed under temporary protective custody of Child Services. Mom, I'm scared, Ethan said anxiously. Sarah squeezed her son's hand. It's okay, Ethan. We'll never be separated again. Mommy's here with you. That night, Sarah fell asleep feeling her son's presence for the first time in a long while. However, in her heart, anxiety about the truth that was about to be revealed swirled. The next day, Sarah and Ethan were called to the police station. A social worker from Child Protective Services was also present. Ethan, can you tell us in detail what happened to you? The detective asked gently. Ethan took a deep breath and began to speak. Dad, no, Michael was using me as a model. Sarah gasped. She listened to her son's story, desperately trying to control her emotions. Ethan continued, at first, I was just modeling regular children's clothes. But as I got older... It's okay, Ethan, Sarah squeezed her son's hand. Take your time. Encouraged by his mother's warmth, Ethan continued, Michael started making me do more extreme photo shoots. Posing in dangerous places, wearing adult-like clothes. The detective and social worker carefully took notes as they listened to Ethan's story. And the scars on your arm? The detective quietly asked. Ethan's face darkened. When I refused to do the photo shoots. Michael. He choked on his words. Sarah hugged her son. It's okay now, Ethan. You're safe. Ethan continued, holding back tears. Michael was living off my earnings. When I refused, he got angry and... The detective nodded with a serious expression. I understand. You're very brave, Ethan. After that, the police located Michael and arrested him. He was to be charged with child exploitation and abuse. Sarah was overwhelmed with complex emotions. How could the man she once loved do such things? Anger, sadness, and guilt swirled within her. Mrs. Johnson, the social worker, gently called out. You're not to blame for any of this. There's a lot we can do to help Ethan. Sarah nodded, wiping away her tears. What should I do? First, Ethan needs emotional care. It will take time to overcome the trauma. I'll refer you to a specialized counselor. Ethan looked up at his mother's face. Mom, can I go back to a normal life? Sarah hugged her son tightly. Of course, Ethan. We'll work hard together. In the weeks that followed, Sarah and Ethan faced many challenges. Legal procedures, psychological counseling, and preparing for Ethan's enrollment in school. It was all difficult, but they supported each other and moved forward step by step. One night, Ethan woke up from a nightmare. Sarah rushed to her son's room and gently embraced him. It's okay, Ethan. Mommy's here. Ethan said through tears, Mom, I never want to go through that again." Sarah gently stroked her son's hair and replied, "I'll never let that happen. Mommy will protect you." Time passed slowly. Ethan gradually regained his smile and got used to his new school. Sarah felt herself growing stronger as she watched her son's growth. The truth was painful and heartbreaking. But by overcoming it, Sarah and Ethan's bond grew deeper and stronger. After Ethan's return, Sarah cooperated with the police to begin a full-scale search for Michael. Based on the information Ethan provided, the investigation progressed rapidly. "Mrs. Johnson, from your son's testimony, we've identified the alias your husband was using," the detective reported. "We're currently monitoring a property rented under that name." Sarah took a deep breath. "Thank you. But what will happen when you find Michael?" The detective answered carefully, "An arrest warrant has been issued. He faces serious charges, but the legal proceedings are yet to come." Meanwhile, Ethan and Sarah began psychological counseling. A trauma care specialist supported their recovery. "Ethan, can you tell me how you're feeling?" the counselor gently asked. Ethan hesitated a little but slowly opened up. I resent Dad, but at the same time, I feel kind of lonely." Sarah felt her heart tighten at her son's words. The counselor nodded. "That's a natural feeling, Ethan. It's normal to have complex emotions." With each session, Ethan and Sarah gradually sorted out their feelings. However, Michael's shadow was always over them. Then, 3 weeks after the investigation began, Michael's whereabouts were finally pinpointed. "We found him," the detective's call made Sarah's heart race. The entire arrest was reported on the news, and Sarah watched with her son in front of the TV. Michael's appearance on the screen was vastly different from the husband Sarah remembered. He looked exhausted and consumed by guilt. "Mom!" Ethan called out in a small voice. Sarah hugged her son. "It's okay, Ethan. This is the end of it all." After Michael's arrest, legal proceedings began in earnest. Sarah consulted with a lawyer and proceeded with responses while prioritizing Ethan's welfare. To overcome this difficult period, Sarah and Ethan supported each other and moved forward step by step, receiving support from professionals. The process of facing the truth was painful, but it was also an important step toward starting a new life. On the day of the trial, when Sarah faced Michael in court, she was filled with complex emotions. Michael himself admitted his guilt and began to speak in a trembling voice. I was trying to be a good father at first. But after losing my job and his debts piled up," he choked on his words. "I took Ethan away because I thought his talent was the only way to save our lives. But that's no excuse. I hurt and exploited my son. Sarah, Ethan. I'm truly sorry." The courtroom fell silent as they listened to Michael's confession. Sarah felt a mix of anger, sadness, and complex emotions. But she also felt a small sense of liberation growing within her. The sentence was harsh. Michael was given a long prison term, but he was also to receive psychological treatment. After the trial, Sarah began to build a new life with Ethan. Ethan started going to school and gradually regained a normal child's life. One day, while having a picnic in the park, Ethan suddenly said, "Mom, in the future, I want to work helping children who have been abused. I want to use my experience to save other children." Sarah looked at her son proudly and emotionally. "Ethan, you're such a strong and kind boy. I'm sure you'll be able to help many children." The two of them leaned on each other and began to walk towards a new future. They moved forward strongly on the path that led to a hopeful